What would you do if one day, you woke up to find that your private property was no longer yours? Not because you sold it, not because you forgot to pay your taxes, but because a group of entitled strangers simply decided it belonged to them? That's exactly what happened to me. And it all started with a lazy summer afternoon and a fishing pole. For 3 years, life had been perfect. My wife, Laura, and I had finally settled into our dream home, 12 acres of beautiful land with a private 3-acre lake. The previous owner had built the lake back in the 1970s as a fishing and swimming retreat for his family, and we had fallen in love with the place the moment we saw it. The lake came with our deed, properly documented, legally surveyed, and indisputably ours. On weekends, I'd grab a cold drink, head down to the dock, and cast a line while Laura read a book on the porch. We had even stocked the lake with bass, enjoying the peace and quiet of owning something truly private. Until one day, I reeled in more than just fish. I was halfway through my second beer when I noticed something strange on the opposite shore. A group of kids splashing in the water. I blinked, confused. Then I spotted a couple setting up lawn chairs and a family unpacking a picnic. On my property. I walked over, trying to keep my temper in check. "Hey there. You guys lost?" A woman, mid-40s, tanned like she spent a little too much time at the country club, turned to me with an amused expression. "Oh, no. The HOA said the lake is open to the community now." I frowned. "The HOA?" She nodded, waving a glossy pamphlet in my face. "Yeah, the Oak Hills HOA. It's listed as a neighborhood feature." I took the paper from her, skimming through it, and my stomach dropped. There, in full color, was a photo of my lake, right under the words, "Private lake access for HOA residents." I barely heard her when she added, "We just moved in. The realtor told us we'd have lake privileges, so we figured we'd come check it out." I clenched my jaw. There was only one problem. I wasn't part of the HOA. I stared at the pamphlet in my hands, my grip tightening as I read the fine print. Exclusive lake access for Oak Hills residents. Community swimming, fishing, and recreation. My lake. My private property. Being advertised like it was part of some neighborhood park. I took a slow, measured breath before turning back to the woman, who was now watching me with mild amusement, completely unaware of how close I was to losing it. "I don't know what your realtor told you, but this lake is private. It belongs to me and my wife. You're trespassing." She blinked, like I had just spoken another language. "But the HOA said." I didn't even let her finish. I turned on my heel and marched back up to the house, pulling out my phone the second I hit the porch. The HOA needed to explain themselves, and they needed to do it now. After a few rings, a saccharine voice answered. "Oak Hills HOA, this is Diane speaking. How can I assist you?" I barely kept my voice level. "Yeah, this is Jim Calloway. I own the property at the end of Greenbrier Road. Can you explain to me why the HOA is telling people they have access to my private lake?" There was a short pause, then the sickly sweet tone returned. "Oh, yes, Mr. Calloway. Since your lake is visible from some of our properties and contributes to the overall ambience of the community, the board voted to designate it as a community feature." I nearly choked. "You voted to do what?" "We've already informed all residents that they have access rights, and it's even listed in our marketing materials. If you try to prevent them from using the lake, we may have to pursue legal action." I hung up before I could say something that would put me in jail. Instead, I called my lawyer, Bill Prescott. Bill had been handling land disputes in this county for longer than I'd been alive, and when I explained what was happening, he let out a slow whistle. "That's a new one. HOA land theft. I've seen some audacity in my day, Jim, but this takes the cake." I emailed him a copy of the pamphlet and, within an hour, he had drafted a cease and desist letter. It was clear, direct, and legally binding. The HOA was to immediately stop claiming any rights to my lake, retract all marketing materials, and inform their residents that they had no access. Their response? They sued me. According to their lawsuit, my lake should be considered a public waterway because it contributed to the character of the neighborhood. Their reasoning? Rainwater helped fill it. By their logic, that meant it wasn't private property anymore. Bill was practically giddy. I can't wait to tear this argument apart. It's like Christmas came early. We countersued for harassment, defamation, and illegal misrepresentation of private property. At our request, the judge issued an injunction barring the HOA from telling residents they had any access rights. But the HOA ignored it. People kept showing up. Every time I confronted them, they waved HOA newsletters in my face listing the lake as a community feature. Some even accused me of trying to keep public land for myself. I was done playing defense. If they wanted to ignore the legal system, I'd give them a lesson they couldn't ignore. I hired a team of contractors and started what I called my landscaping project. First, I had an 8-foot-tall security fence installed around the entire property, complete with reinforced gates, motion-activated cameras, and no trespassing signs posted every 10 feet. But that was just the beginning. I wanted something that would make a statement. Something so absurd and so impenetrable that even the most entitled HOA member wouldn't dare challenge it. So I built a moat. A 10-foot wide, 6-foot deep trench encircling the entire lake, set back 20 feet from the shoreline. We filled it with water, lined it with stone, and added decorative bridges that led to the lake's edge. Each bridge had a locked gate that only I had the key to. To really rub salt in the wound, I stocked the moat with koi fish and installed decorative fountains. When the HOA inevitably complained, I simply smiled and told them, it's a water feature to enhance the natural beauty of my property. Karen lost her mind. Within days, she was on my front porch, her lips pressed so tight they looked like they might disappear. Mr. Calloway, this is ridiculous. You can't just build a moat. I folded my arms. Sure I can. It's my property. She sputtered, gesturing wildly toward the trench. This is a safety hazard. What if someone falls in? I raised an eyebrow. So you're admitting HOA members plan to trespass? Her face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. The very next day, I received a stack of violation notices. Allegations of unauthorized construction, obstruction of community resources, and unsafe landscaping. I used them as kindling for my fire pit. The best part? Since I wasn't part of the HOA, their rules didn't apply to me. The only authority that could stop me was the county. And when they sent out an inspector, I had every permit, zoning approval, and environmental regulation covered. Not only was the moat fully legal, but the inspector even complimented me on my creative approach to property security. Karen and her HOA had thrown everything they had at me. They had sued me, lied about my property, ignored a court order, and even tried to claim my lake as public land. Now, they were standing on the other side of my moat, seething with rage, completely powerless. And I was just getting started. Karen wasn't used to losing. That much was obvious from the way she stood at the edge of my property, fists clenched, glaring at the moat like it had personally insulted her. I had seen some entitled HOA board members in my time, but Karen took things to a new level. She wasn't just furious, she was seething. And when people like Karen lose, they don't admit defeat. They escalate. The first sign of trouble came when my lawyer, Bill Prescott, called me 2 weeks later with an amused chuckle. "Jim, you're not gonna believe this one. The HOA is trying to get the county to seize your land under eminent domain." I nearly dropped my coffee. Eminent domain? For what? They're arguing that since rainwater fills the lake, it should be classified as a public waterway and transferred to the HOA for community benefit. I let out a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. Please tell me the county isn't taking this seriously. Well, they might have. That sent a chill down my spine. Eminent domain is no joke. If the county ruled in the HOA's favor, I could lose access to my own lake. I had spent years making sure everything about my property was legally airtight, but if someone on the zoning board was friendly with Karen, this could turn into a serious fight. Bill and I wasted no time gathering evidence: our original deed, property surveys, county-approved permits, the judge's injunction barring the HOA from claiming lake access. We had an ironclad case. But then Bill dug a little deeper and uncovered something interesting. Karen had bribed a county clerk. Emails, texts, even a check written from the HOA's discretionary fund. She had paid someone to push the eminent domain request through. The second Bill sent those documents to the county attorney, the whole thing collapsed. The request was denied, the clerk was fired, and Karen was personally fined for attempting to interfere with government processes. But she still wasn't done. A week after her eminent domain scam fell apart, a county inspector showed up on my property, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Calloway, we received an anonymous complaint about environmental violations related to your moat." I sighed. "Let me guess. The HOA?" The inspector shrugged. "I can't say, but, yes." Karen's new angle was that my moat was a destructive water hazard that was harming the local ecosystem. She claimed I had damaged the natural landscape and that my water runoff was contaminating the area. I had all the proper permits, of course, but as the inspector walked around, something caught his eye. He knelt near the edge of the moat, frowning at a dark, oily film floating on the surface. This isn't normal," he muttered, scooping a sample into a vial. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't put that there. Sure enough, when I checked my security cameras that night, the footage showed two shadowy figures sneaking onto my land at 3 a.m. One of them was Todd Benson, Karen's loyal lackey. The other? Karen herself. And in their hands? Bags of chemical runoff, which they dumped directly into my moat. They were trying to frame me for an environmental violation. The next morning, I sent the footage to Bill, and he nearly howled with laughter. "She just committed a felony on tape, Jim. I hope she's got a good lawyer, because this one's going to court." Karen and Todd were slapped with a fine for illegal dumping. But that wasn't even the best part. Since they had introduced a harmful substance into a protected water system, the county classified it as an environmental crime. Karen wasn't just facing a fine anymore. She was looking at criminal charges. At this point, any reasonable person would have backed down. But Karen? She was beyond reason. She wasn't just trying to win anymore, she wanted revenge. A few days later, a group of men in county worker uniforms showed up at my gate. One of them approached with a clipboard. "We're here for a routine property assessment." I didn't buy it for a second. The badge on his chest looked off, and his uniform was a little too clean. Routine assessment? I crossed my arms. Funny, since I didn't request one. The guy hesitated. Behind him, I saw another worker trying to take photos of my property with his phone. That was all the proof I needed. I pulled out my own phone and called the sheriff. "Hey, Sheriff Grady. You might want to get down here. I've got some guys impersonating county officials on my land." The moment they heard the word sheriff, the fake inspectors took off running. By the time the real authorities arrived, they had already confessed. Karen had hired them to pretend to be county workers so they could find something to use against me in court. That was the final straw. The sheriff personally warned Karen that if she pulled another stunt, she'd be facing jail time. But Karen wasn't going to wait for another plan. She was going to take matters into her own hands. That night, at around 1:30 a.m., my security system lit up like a Christmas tree. Someone was on my property. I checked the cameras and saw a single figure creeping toward the security fence. It was Karen. She was dressed in all black, carrying bolt cutters. She went straight for the cameras first, trying to cut the wires. Then she moved toward the fence, struggling to break the lock. What she didn't know was that I had recently upgraded to motion sensor floodlights and infrared cameras. The second she touched the fence, the lights snapped on, bathing her in blinding white light. She froze. Then, she turned and ran. I grabbed my phone and called the police. You might want to send a squad car. HOA President Karen Whitmore is currently trespassing on my land. By the time the officers arrived, Karen was hiding in the bushes near my driveway, covered in mud. They arrested her on the spot. Her mugshot ended up on the local news the next morning. The HOA was falling apart. And I wasn't done yet. Karen's mugshot was all over the local news by the next morning, but if I thought her arrest would be the end of it, I was dead wrong. Some people, when they're beaten, accept their losses and move on. Karen was not one of those people. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when my lawyer, Bill, called. He didn't even say hello. Jim, you're gonna love this, Karen made bail. I sighed. Of course she did. And do you want to guess what she did the moment she got home? I leaned against the counter. Started packing to move to Florida? Bill let out a low chuckle. I wish. No, she started a Facebook group. Oh, great. What's it called? Lake Access for All. I almost dropped my mug. Bill continued. She's rallying what's left of her supporters, claiming your MOAT is an environmental disaster and that you're trying to steal nature from the community. I pulled up the page and, sure enough, there it was, a wall of posts blaming me for destroying local wildlife and endangering neighborhood children. But the best part? She had edited photos of my property to make the MOAT look like some kind of radioactive wasteland, complete with exaggerated floodwaters and ominous storm clouds. At first, I ignored it. It was Karen being Karen. But then she crossed the line. A few days later, I noticed a strange buzzing sound overhead. I looked up to see a drone hovering over my property, recording everything. I stormed inside, pulled up my security feeds, and sure enough, Karen had hired someone to fly a drone over my land. The videos popped up online within hours, complete with captions like, "Local landowner builds dangerous moat to keep children from swimming," and, "What is he hiding?" I was fuming, but my lawyer was practically giddy when I called him. "Oh, Jim, this is beautiful. She just violated the restraining order." We filed for an emergency court hearing, and the judge was not amused. Karen was ordered to take down all posts immediately and was banned from posting about me or my property in any way, shape, or form. But karma wasn't done with her yet. See, remember how I stocked the moat with koi fish? Turns out, they were a protected ornamental species. And Karen's drone spooked them. Several of the koi died from stress, and, thanks to my security cameras catching the whole thing, we had proof that Karen's drone had directly caused harm to protected wildlife. When we presented the footage in court, the judge went ballistic. Karen was slapped with a hefty fine for animal cruelty and a violation of drone regulations. She tried to argue that she didn't know the fish were there, but that didn't hold up so well when Bill played her own drone footage in court, zooming in on the fish. Her face went redder than a fire truck. At this point, even the HOA was getting sick of her. They had already lost thousands from the lawsuit, and now their board members were under scrutiny. Then came the final blow. A few of the homeowners, the ones who had been tricked into thinking they had lake access, started digging into their real estate contracts. And guess what they found? Karen had been getting kickbacks from the real estate company. Every time a house was sold under the fake promise of lake access, she got a nice little bonus from the realtor, Nancy Holloway. When the new HOA board found out, they turned on her instantly. Karen was sued for misappropriation of funds, forced to pay back tens of thousands of dollars, and officially kicked out of the HOA board. Her life was unraveling faster than she could control. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One afternoon, as I was tending to the property, I saw a "for sale" sign go up in front of Karen's house. She had finally given up. Rumor had it she was moving to Florida. Somewhere with no lakes, no moats, and, most importantly, no HOAs. And just like that, the nightmare was over. The HOA had collapsed under its own greed. The new board, desperate to clean up the mess Karen left behind, actually approached me professionally and asked if we could negotiate supervised community events at the lake. I agreed, but on my terms. They were allowed 2 community fishing days per year, but only with proper insurance, signed waivers, and a maintenance contribution for the road leading to my property. They took the deal without hesitation. Life had finally returned to normal. Well, almost. A few months later, one last incident reminded me just how ridiculous this whole saga had been. A local news crew, having caught wind of the drama, showed up wanting to interview me. But before they even got the chance, Karen, desperate for one last moment of attention, rushed to my gate, demanding they cover the truth about the MOAT. She was mid-rant, wildly gesturing toward the lake, when one of the decorative fountains turned on, soaking her from head to toe. The cameras caught the whole thing. The news crew decided there wasn't much of a story after all. But my wife and I? We still rewatch that security footage on bad days. The MOAT had done its job. And in the end, the only thing Karen had managed to drown was her own reputation. With Karen gone, life finally settled back into the peaceful routine my wife and I had built before the HOA nightmare began. The lake was ours again. The MOAT stood as a reminder that boundaries, literal and legal, mattered, and the HOA had learned the hard way not to mess with property they didn't own. The lawsuits wrapped up over the next few months. The real estate company was forced to compensate every homeowner who had been misled about lake access, cutting checks for $15,000 each. The HOA, now under new leadership, officially acknowledged in writing that they had no rights to my land, and I had the document framed in my office just in case someone ever got any bright ideas. Even better, the county updated my property records to include additional legal protections, ensuring that no future HOA could ever try to claim ownership of my lake again. That cost me a couple thousand in filing fees, but it was worth every penny for the peace of mind. With the legal battles behind me, something unexpected happened. The MOAT took on a life of its own. A local university's environmental science department got wind of what we had done and reached out, asking if they could study the ecosystem we had unintentionally created. It turned out the MOAT had become a perfect habitat for a variety of fish, birds, and amphibians. We even had a few rare species of herons nesting near the water. The county's environmental board gave us an award for innovative wildlife preservation, which I found hilarious considering the MOAT was originally built out of sheer spite. With so much attention on conservation, I worked out an agreement with the new HOA board. They wanted limited lake access for the community, but this time, everything was on my terms. 2 supervised fishing days per year, strictly regulated, with signed waivers and insurance coverage. In return, they helped maintain the private road leading to my property and contributed to local wildlife preservation efforts. Meanwhile, Karen's legacy had completely crumbled. After moving to Florida, she tried stirring up trouble online under fake accounts, but the moment we proved it was her, she was held in contempt of court and fined again. Last I heard, she was picking up trash for community service. A fitting end, considering the mess she had left behind. The best part? My property value skyrocketed. The MOAT, once labeled a ridiculous stunt, was now considered a unique luxury feature. Developers even approached me about buying the land at triple what I originally paid. But I wasn't selling. This was home. Moat and all. Even now, every morning when I walk outside with my coffee, I watch the koi fish lazily circling the moat, the sun glinting off the water, the peaceful silence undisturbed by HOA complaints. My wife still calls our house the castle. I think she's earned that one. And yes, I did eventually install that drawbridge. It's mostly decorative, but I'll be damned if I don't lower it dramatically whenever we have company. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. If I had tried to be reasonable with Karen and the HOA, I'd still be fighting trespassers and legal battles. But by standing my ground, and digging a 10-foot trench, I sent a message they couldn't ignore. Sometimes, the best way to deal with people who don't respect boundaries is to build a bigger one. What about you? Have you ever had to deal with an HOA overreach or an entitled neighbor? Share your stories below. I'd love to see who had it worse.